really appreciate your putting this event together and giving me an opportunity to share what I've learned over the last 45 years about the problems that are inherent in our money system, and giving me an opportunity to also outline some of the solutions that I've discovered and developed along the way. And welcome everyone. Happy to have you here, and hoping that we'll have a lively discussion after my presentation. Okay, I've titled this slideshow, "A World Without Money, Interest, and Debt." Now, this kind of world might seem preposterous to anyone who's been conventionally trained in economics, money and banking or related fields. But, what I'm talking about is the new world without money, interest, and debt will still have exchange media to perform the money function. It will still have rewards for taking risk, which will replace interest, and it will still have obligations of one sort or another that will replace debt. And I see this as a pathway toward economic equity, social justice, freedom, and peace. And this is the kind of world that I think we would all like to live in. So what started me out on this quest 45 years ago was trying to understand why we have these recurrent economic depressions, inflation, debt crises that keep recurring, why we're always in conflict and war with somebody, why we have hunger and squalor in the midst of plenty. And it occurs to me to ask the question as well, what kind of future are we facing? We've been on a path for a long time, which seems to be leading us toward an abyss. What are the emerging challenges and opportunities that we're facing as businesses, communities, and governments? So I concluded a long time ago that we are on the brink of a global collapse of one sort or another. We have environmental changes that are taking place with droughts and floods and extreme weather events all over the world. We have polluted air, land, water. It's becoming more difficult now to find drinkable sources of fresh water. Even here where I live in Tucson, we have many of our wells that provide much of our water are polluted with toxic chemicals that are known carcinogens. We're facing the end of cheap oil and gas. We're not going to run out of oil and gas, but we're experiencing a situation where it's costing ever more in terms of energy input to get the energy out. So all of these resources are being depleted, and we're seeing financial disruptions of different kinds, bankruptcies, unemployments, financial crises like the one we faced in 2008. And basically all of our institutions are breaking down. And I sort of liken this to the metamorphic change between the caterpillar and the butterfly. And I'll say more of that as we go along. So what has characterized our modern civilization has been exploitation and domination. The colonial era seems to have passed with the independence of different countries in Africa and Asia and other places around the world. But colonialism still exists. It's economic colonialism rather than political colonialism. And we have a history of people being dispossessed of their wealth, their land, and their resources. We had overt slavery for a long period of time. Now that has given way to more subtle forms of slavery, wage slavery, debt slavery, predatory commerce, monopoly, and oligopoly. And we're seeing governments collude amongst themselves with corporations. So what is driving this destructive engine? I concluded quite some time ago that the engine of destruction is actually the growth imperative that is built in to the debt money system. As I will explain presently, money is created on the basis of interest-bearing debt. And this causes debt to increase exponentially. And in the process of trying to avoid default, companies and individuals need to find a way to get money out of the economy So a lot of my colleagues have argued that the driver of this destructive path that we're on is the ready availability of fossil fuel energy. I contend that that's the enabler, but not the driver. The driver is the debt money system. And of course, the brake is nature. Nature is telling us that you cannot have exponential growth forever. So we need to look at the question of what is money and how is it created. Now, we all learn in Economics 101 that money is a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a measure of value. But this is not correct. This tells us at best what money does, not what money is. And these are different functions that need to be performed by different things. Now, it's true, when money was in the form of, let's say, a gold coin or a silver coin, it could perform all three of those functions. It could be a medium of exchange, it could be a store of value, and it could measure value. But no commodity has ever been sufficient in providing for the exchange function. So a commodity can be a store of value or a measure of value, but it cannot be a flexible medium of exchange. It cannot expand in quantity in step with expansion in economic output. One of the noted economists of the 20th century, Professor John Kenneth Galbraith, said, "The process by which banks create money is so simple that the mind is repelled." And I've found that to be true every time I give a lecture. People's eyes glaze over when I tell them about it, and they just can't seem to believe what I'm telling them. But here it is direct from the Bank of England, a working paper that was published a few years ago, 2015. It says, in the real world, banks provide financing through money creation. That is, they create deposits of new money through lending, and in doing so are mainly constrained by profitability, solvency, and considerations. So what is that saying? In short, banks create money by making loans. These loans are the deposits to borrowers' accounts. And the constraints on that have nothing to do with so-called reserves or other things. It's basically profitability and solvency considerations. Now, I've known this for a long time. I discovered it through a publication from the Federal Reserve, which was published in 1966, and I discovered it in the mid-1970s. They said the actual process of money creation takes place primarily in banks. Checkable liabilities of banks are money. These liabilities are customers' accounts. They increase when the proceeds of loans made by banks are credited to borrowers' accounts. Now, it'll be easier to understand that if I show you a picture. So here's a bank. And as we said, banks create money as deposits or account balances when they grant a loan. So let's say you go to a bank and you say, I want to borrow some money. I want a mortgage so that I can buy a house. Well, the bank makes two entries on their books. You sign a mortgage note, which becomes an asset to the bank. And in turn, the bank makes a deposit to your account. This is the creation of debt money, which is a liability on the bank's ledger. So with this simple act, the bank has created money. Is your mind repelled? Well, there's a problem with this. Banks do not do all of this for free. When they grant a loan, or so-called loan, they want you to pay interest, and interest accrues over time. You borrow, let's say, $100 today that needs to be repaid in 1 year's time. If the interest rate is 10%, then at the end of 1 year, you will owe the bank $110 or 110 pounds or euros or whatever the going currency is in your jurisdiction. But the bank did not create sufficient money for the interest to be paid. So where are you going to get the money to pay the interest as well as the principal? The only way you can do that is by competing in the market with others to try to get sufficient money that was created when someone else took a loan from a bank. So this is essential to be understood, that the banks create money by making loans, but they don't create enough money to pay the interest on those loans. Here are some quotes that describe the extent of the money power. And money is so important because it is a powerful tool. The patriarch of the Rothschild dynasty said, "Give me the power to create a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." Reginald McKenna, who was president of the Midland Bank in England, said, "Those who create and issue money and credit direct the policies of government and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people." E.C. Regal said, "The debt economy rests upon a conspiracy between the political state and the banking interests against commercial exchange." Now, you don't have to be a believer in conspiracy theories to understand that it is in the narrow materialistic self-interest of the people who control money to try to consolidate ever more power and wealth in their own hands. So the modern banking system actually, well, it began before the Bank of England, but the Bank of England provided the prototype for the central bank. So now we have central banks in every country throughout the world. The Bank of England was chartered in 1694 when William III came to power. He was fighting a war against France, and he needed money to finance the war. And of course, it's always there's always a limit to how much you can tax your subjects directly. So the William Patterson and his associates who founded the Bank of England came to the king and they said, "We will give you all the money you need to fight your war if you will give us the power to issue banknotes and lend them into circulation." So that gave the Bank of England a virtual monopoly on credit. So the bank financed the King's War. The Bank of England became the model for central banks around the world, including the first and second banks of the United States. And that's an interesting story in itself, which I write about in my book, The End of Money and the Future of Civilization. So this collusion between the financial power and the political power has continued a relentless drive towards fascist tyranny. And we've been on this train for now more than 300 years. And we are now reaching the point where we will have a global fascist government. One of the people who warned against this was Franklin Roosevelt. He was president from 1933 until 1944 when he died. He said the first truth is that the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That, in essence, is fascism. Ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or by any other controlling private power. Now, the central banks are not part of the government. In some places, they may be nominally part of the government. In others, they are not. The Federal Reserve banks, for example, are not part of the US government. They are separate and independent and owned by banking corporations. Now, this is a very important quote from Professor Carroll Quigley. He was a Georgetown historian, taught in the Foreign Service School for many years, trained many diplomats, many US diplomats who went into the Foreign Service and the State Department. He was a former mentor of President Bill Clinton. Clinton praised him in his acceptance speech when he was nominated for president in 1992. Quigley wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. It's been said that if you don't understand history, you are bound to repeat it. And Quigley was an insider. He knew the ins and outs of the power structure. And he said this, and it's very important to pay attention to it. He said the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. And that's not the half of it. We've seen now how central banks, by controlling interest rates, they can control the entire economy. By controlling the money supply, they control the entire economy. And I'll get to another mechanism by which they control the economy and the politics of each country. So we're told that the purpose of the central banks is to keep inflation low and to try to promote full employment. Well, that's window dressing. That is not the truth. The true purpose of central banks is to enable the monopolization of credit and the practice of usury by the banking cartel, to enable profligate deficit spending by national governments, and to enrich and empower a super class. And that's becoming ever more apparent as time goes on. So we have a flawed system that is being kept alive by this collusive arrangement between finance and politics. But we need to ask, why are all the governments in debt? Why is this a phenomenon? Is there any natural reason for governments to be in debt? Why can't they balance their budgets? Why are budget deficits chronic? Why do these debts continue to grow ever faster and are now reaching astronomical proportions? Well, the answer is, and I haven't heard this from any other academic or economist, but under the interest-based debt money system, central governments must assume the role of borrower of last resort. You know, we hear about central banks being the lender of last resort, but there also is a borrower of last resort, and that's the government. And that's necessary to keep the money supply pumped up and prevent economic depressions. Now, John Maynard Keynes, you may recall, proposed that during the Great Depression, governments needed to step in and create money in order to get out of the depression. Now, his theory was that by pumping up the money supply, we could get the economy working again. And once the economy was recovered, then the governments could run a surplus in order to repay the deficit that was run during the difficult times. But of course, as we've seen, that time never comes for repayment of the deficits that the government ran during the Depression. Keynes didn't seem to realize that this was a one-way street, that because of the interest that is built into the money creation process, there needs to be a continual expansion of debt to keep the money supply from contracting and prevent economic depression. Well, just look at this. This is a chart of the US government national debt over the period of time from 1900 up until the present, actually up until 2020. And you can see that the peak of this graph is about a little more than $23 trillion. But according to the US debt clock, the actual debt as of last week was $28.7 trillion. And we're seeing budget deficits, federal budget deficits now that are so extraordinary in relation to past history that it just boggles the mind. And nobody is batting an eye about it. The US Congress just passed a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure bill that is going to be financed through additional budget deficits. And it's the same way around the world. But looking at this in relation to gross domestic product, which is supposed to be a measure of overall economic activity, we see that currently the US government debt to GDP is well above 125%, surpassing the deficit or the debt that was incurred during World War II to finance the war. Now, that debt in relation to GDP shrunk because of the increase in GDP as we had tremendous increases in productivity from 1945 on until, up until the present, actually. But because the debt is now growing faster than GDP, and we're at the end of the rope as far as fixes are concerned, we're not going to see a similar decline because of growth of GDP in the future. So it's not only the government sector that's exponentially growing debt. This is a chart of private sector debt from about the mid-1950s up until 2016. This is the latest data that I could find. Here's GDP. This is, excuse me, that's not GDP. This is national income, tax revenues and such. So we can see in relation to that, it's quite small compared to the private sector debt. And this is true of all countries around the world. Now, with the 2008 financial meltdown, the whole system was on the brink of collapse. So there was an extraordinary move that was taken by the central banks around the world in order to prevent this collapse. And it was basically adding to the previously modest amounts of direct purchases of securities by central banks to astronomical amounts of stocks and bonds that central banks have now added to their portfolio. Now, this is massive manipulation of the securities markets, and it's happening all around the world. This chart just shows a few of the major central banks, including the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, Federal Reserve, Bank of England, and the Swiss National Bank. And this is the ECB. You can see what they've done since 2008, from virtually nothing on their balance sheet to enormous purchases of stocks and bonds. So to sum up, the political money regime is dysfunctional and exploitative. A large proportion of the money is improperly issued. You know, it goes to sweetheart deals. If you're a favored politician, maybe you get a loan on favorable terms that you might never have to repay, or it's coupled with some sure thing investment that will allow you to pay it back easily and add to it. So there's massive corruption of the political system because of this money power. It doesn't go where it's most deserved or needed, which is the small and local enterprises that are the backbone of every community. It exploits productive enterprise through interest, bank fees, and foreclosures. You know, banks make credit easy and interest rates low for a period of time. And then when everybody is in debt, they tighten up on loans and increase interest rates, forcing bankruptcies and foreclosures. So this money system is manipulated for the benefit of its controllers, creating a power elite and a wealthy superclass. And we've seen enormous increases in the number of billionaires and the amount of their wealth over the last several decades. So we have massive centralization of power and concentration of wealth, undermining of democratic government, inequity and class conflict. And as I said, we have this thing driving artificial growth through the debt imperative and the growth imperative as everybody scrambles to try to avoid defaulting on their debt. So interest-bearing debt growing to impossible levels is the phenomenon we're experiencing now. We're seeing banks bailed out. In 2008, instead of bailing out the debtors, the governments and the central banks kept the banks alive by bailing them out, basically giving them government bonds in return for their uncollectible assets. We have structural adjustment programs and austerity for many. Greece is a good case in point. I've spent a lot of time in Greece, and Greece has been forced into austerity, which is damaging small to medium-sized businesses and individuals. It's damaging people on pensions and forcing Greece to take on additional debt. Political corruption, as we mentioned, attacks on social programs, privatization of government-owned assets, which has been ongoing for a long time. When you think about the commons, we say that the commons is comprised of all of those things that weren't created. There are common heritage. The earth was not created by anyone who now lives on it, So the commons have been privatized increasingly and taken over to generate profits for a few. And we're seeing reduced national sovereignty through this politicization of money, which is leading to despotism. So the corporate power is taking over the power of government through these massive banking institutions, which use as instruments the central banks, Bank for International Settlements, the IMF, and the World Bank. And this is leading us to the neo-feudal New World Order. What we need to be doing instead is moving power from national governments in a democratic way to the people and to communities through credit clearing networks and community currencies, which is what I'm going to present subsequently. This is what I call the butterfly society. So where are we headed as a civilization? We see movies like Mad Max, where we have a post-apocalyptic situation of people greedily and selfishly fighting against one another to gain whatever remains of the resources. So we have violent conflict and waste, and a new dark age is in prospect. Or will we choose societal metamorphosis to move away from the old caterpillar society to a new butterfly society, where we choose to cooperate, be generous with one another and share what we have, be compassionate, be in solidarity with all humanity across racial, ethnic, national lines. A complete restructuring is what is called for. So looking at the emerging butterfly society, this is already underway. I think we've already entered the chrysalis stage of this metamorphic process. While the old caterpillar economics promotes continuous growth of economic output and quantitative measures of value and well-being, more is better, bigger is better, accumulate as much capital as you can, passive income it's called. We're consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. The emphasis has been on getting more and more product out of less and less labor, making it more difficult for those who subsist by selling their labor to continue to subsist, to generate income for themselves. Growing disparities of wealth and power, which is the consumer society. In contrast, the new butterfly economics, as I call it, promotes steady state economic output. As Gandhi said, there's enough for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. The emphasis now shifts from quantitative to qualitative measures of value and well-being. How about more leisure, more peace, more time to play, more time to spend in doing things with people we enjoy? A time to restore the commons, that is to create systems that will return us to a Garden of Eden rather than a despoiled planet. The emphasis will be on resource productivity, that is getting more value out of each pound of minerals or each barrel of oil or other natural resource. More equitable distribution of wealth and power. This is what I call the convivial society, to borrow a term from Ivan Illich. So the things that we need to do to resolve our predicament include harmonizing the incentives with the desired outcomes. You know, right now we have corporations trying to maximize their profits by increasing their sales, reducing their costs. So with the model that they're using now, this requires repeat business. They don't build products that are durable, repairable, recyclable. They build products that are intended to wear out. They build products that will be superseded by new products with minor improvements. So we need to harmonize the incentives with the desired outcome, which is to reduce waste, to eliminate the growth imperative. We need to end the creation of money based on interest-bearing debt. We need to separate money and state. I have a chapter in my book, The End of Money, that addresses that point. We need to tame the corporate beast. When I talk about the corporate beast, corporations have actually become a beast, an alien entity. You know, the aliens that we need to fear are not extraterrestrial. They're aliens that we've created right here on Earth, called corporations. The corporations are created by charter granted by a government. They are creatures of the government. And the corporate charter was granted in order to perform some socially useful function by aggregating capital to do that. In the process, the owners or contributors of capital to a corporation were given the privilege of limited liability. That means if you own a share of corporate stock, your liability is limited only to the assets that you put into the corporation, not to your personal assets. Well, the time was when corporations were very limited. Charter would have a limited duration, let's say for 20 years. And the corporate charter would also say the corporation could only do this particular function. Well, those limitations have long since been eliminated through this collusion between politics and finance. So now corporations can do whatever they want. There is no limit on their lifetime. They basically, as I said, have taken over the functions of government. And this globalization that has been the process over the last several decades needs to come to an end. We need to go from globalization to relocalization. We need to relocalize spending, saving, investing, production, and distribution. We need to rebuild this civilization from the bottom up, starting with existing communities. And we need to decentralize the control of credit to the communities and restructure our institutions and systems on a foundation of better values and ideals. So the starting point is with the exchange function. I won't have time to talk about the savings and investment function or the measure of value function, but those are also covered in my book. So I envision a new global internet of exchange based on human solidarity, cooperation, and mutual aid. How do we transfer value? We can give someone a gift without any expectation of return. This is voluntary. We can be forced to give up value, either through theft, robbery, or extortion, or by taxes that the government insists that we pay. But the vast majority of value transfers are in the realm of reciprocal exchange. This is voluntary agreement where you expect to get as much as you give and give as much as you get. The ways of mediating exchange, reciprocal exchange, are through political fiat money or through the innovative exchange mechanisms that I'm going to talk about. So how do we manage reciprocal exchange? We can do it through direct barter. But this is a very limited mechanism. You have to have something I want. I have to have something you want. Otherwise, we cannot have a direct barter. Another possibility is a third-party credit instrument. Now, that can be the official currencies or bank credit that we're used to using, or it can be private currencies issued by producers, or it can be through direct credit clearing amongst buyers and sellers, which I will explain. So a proper currency is a credit instrument that represents the value of goods and services that are available for sale now or in the immediate future. So try to keep that in mind as we go through what a proper currency has to do. Private and community currencies and credit clearing exchanges can provide producers and local economies with a reliable source of credit and supplemental payment media based on real value that is created within a community or region. Now, this is in drastic contrast to money that's created by banks by making loans at interest. Well, let's take an example of how a business or municipality might issue a currency into circulation. It might issue the currency by paying its workers or suppliers with its currency in return for the labor, services, and supplies that group provides to them. Now, of course, the workers, they need to get value for that currency. So they look to the merchants in the local community to accept that currency as well in return for the goods and services that they sell. Now, that currency can circulate any number of times amongst the merchants and other people in the community before it goes back to the issuer to be extinguished in return for the goods and services that business or municipal issuer promised. So this is the completion of the reciprocity circuit. The points to understand is that a currency has a beginning when it's issued, and it has an end when it's redeemed, not for some other currency, but for goods and services that the issuer promised to provide. Now, there's a proper basis of issue and an improper basis of issue. So when we talk about municipalities being issuers of a community currency, the proper basis is the anticipated revenues that they get from taxes and fees for services. Basically, they would be monetizing the value of the services that they provide. Likewise, businesses. They can issue a currency based on their capacity to provide valuable goods or services to the market. But there can be associations of these entities as well who enter into a cooperative agreement to jointly issue a currency based on the combination of these bases. Some examples from the real world. During the Great Depression, there were many different scrip issues, as they were called, issued by different entities, businesses, municipalities, and others. And this is one example that I feature in my book called Larkin Merchandise Bonds. During the Depression, there was a lack of money in circulation, so the Larkin Company, which had a number of retail outlets in the Buffalo, Niagara Falls area of New York State, they paid their workers in part with these merchandise bonds, and then received them back and redeemed them for merchandise. Canadian Tire money has been around since the mid-1950s. It's a rebate currency that can be redeemed dollar for dollar with Canadian money for subsequent purchases at Canadian Tire stores around around Canada and others. Over the last 40 years, we've seen a lot of community currencies spring up. Let Systems, Berkshires in the US, Toronto dollars, Salt Spring Island dollars in Canada, Bristol pounds, Brixton pounds, Lewis pounds, and many others in the UK, Chiemgauer and Regio Gold in Europe. But these currencies, for the most part, have not had much impact. And the reasons for that is they typically follow an ineffective model. That is, they're sold for cash, which doesn't get us any independence from conventional money. They have an improper or an inadequate value basis. There's insufficient involvement by the business community. They rely too much on volunteer management, and people are suspicious of them because they're still enthralled to political money. We're getting short on time, and I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to skip over these and get to direct credit clearing. Mutual credit clearing involves an association of producers who agree to come together and accept each other's credit as payment instead of being paid in cash. So the participants use their own credit directly within this network of trust. The way it starts is you have an issuing member who is allowed to have a negative balance, starts the ball rolling by drawing on his credit line to buy something from another producer. So this member gets a debit to his account, this one gets a credit to her account. Those credits can then circulate throughout the network, eventually coming back to the issuer, who then gets a credit in return for his goods and services, which then brings his account balance back to zero. This is real. This has been going on for a long time now. A primary example is the Vera Bank in Switzerland, which started out during the Great Depression when small and medium-sized businesses came together to try to find a way to continue to do business despite the lack of Swiss francs in circulation. We've had over the last 45 years or so a number of commercial trade exchanges spring up to do the same thing. According to the IRTA, the International Reciprocal Trade Association, these trade exchanges collectively do about $12 to $14 billion worth of trades a year. And these trade exchanges aren't banks. They're not subject to banking regulations. In the US, they're recognized by the IRS as third-party record keepers. So the future that I see is mutual credit clearing exchanges will proliferate around the world. Standards of design and practice will emerge, which will enable local exchanges to be networked into a worldwide web of exchange that will maintain control of credit at the community level while providing a globally useful means of payment. These resources, you can consult these, they're all on my website. And I'll stop sharing my screen and we can go to Q&A.